So I didn't know Mike was going to say that, and I think it's a great wrap-up for us. That geopolitical shift, I mentioned Brexit at the beginning. The UK was one of the first countries in the world to have to deal with that in 2020. And I think it really brought it into our line of vision, perhaps faster than most countries in the world. Earlier in January, we took 40 of the open source community who signed up at random to the House of Commons to be heard by politicians, and each of them had 90 seconds to introduce themselves and what they did. And I asked them one question. I asked if they felt like they were part of the UK tech sector, and nobody put their hand up. I asked them if they felt part of the global tech sector, and every single one put their hand up. Because open source is the submarine under the digital economy, and it's a global submarine. We span borders, and as Mike says, we need our politicians, and we need those making regulation that apply to us to understand that and span borders too, because that's the future of digital and technology. So I said it's like being in my kitchen. It gets more and more like being in my kitchen with the people that I'm bringing onto the stage next. I'd like to introduce my friend Peter Zeitstev, founder of Percona even, and Co-Root. Stephen Augustus, head of open source at Cisco, and OpenUK board member Liz Rice, who is the chief open source officer at Isovalent. Truly unbelievable people. So I said it gets more and more like my kitchen, and we're going to have some very honest conversation here now that you may not expect on this stage. Cut me in half, and like a stick of rock, it says open source. Liz Rice, do you believe in open source?
I do believe in open source, yes.
Stephen Augustus, do you believe in open source?
I do.
Peter, with that hat on, do you believe in open source?
Of course not.
Of course not.
I do.
Okay, I do's the line. Talk to your wife about you saying that one. So we all believe in open source, yet we've heard Bruce talk about the future and where is open source going, and potentially having some maybe controversial ideas about how it moves forward. We've heard Jono talk about the power of community. For me, I learned open source from many people in this room who taught me about it as a community, as a contributor group, but I was a lawyer. And fundamentally, the definition of open source, and the one that governments have tended to use historically, is that it's software that's freely distributed where the source is shared, and it's on an OSI-approved license or one that complies with the open source definition that Bruce will tell you about. Liz, do you agree?
So I'm not a lawyer, and I honestly don't really care that much about licenses. I mean, I only care about licenses to the extent that I want to be able to use other people's software, contribute to other people's software, have people contribute to my projects. But the actual license, that's not that interesting to me. The engineering is what's interesting to me, and the community is what's interesting to me. I think those two things can coexist and should coexist, but I don't think the majority of engineers who are out there participating in open source projects particularly get excited about licenses in the way that lawyers like Amanda.
I find that really hard to believe, Liz. I have met so many software engineers who are so much more excited about open source licenses than I am. I really struggle with that. Stephen, thoughts?
Yeah, so I also don't care about licenses. The classic preamble, I'm also not a lawyer. I think the friction that license discussions can create is what I care about more, right? So I think we've been talking about creating community, having a strategy around deploying community, being successful in marketing projects and delivering projects and getting good work done. That license friction often comes into play, and I think we're seeing it. We've had conversations over the last few months with interesting licensing decisions from very popular open source projects, and I think that has spawned lots of discussion, lots of friction, even internally, and figuring out, can I still use this?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so we'll come back to that in the social contract in just a second. Peter.
Yeah, so I think license is actually necessary, but not sufficient for bona fide, useful open source project, right? And I think we also, in the last few years, those license changes, right, which are very disruptive for community, right, in which are possible if that's what governance is allowed, right. We also saw large companies like Red Hat bastardizing GPL, right?
Did you just say that?
In terms of restricting, I think, more than it was intended. So, license is not enough.
And even when we look at that legal definition, if we look at the public sector, not just in the UK, but anywhere in the world, one of the challenges is that the number one reason until this year, in every survey that we did, showed that people moved to open source because of cost savings. And in the public sector, what that means is removing vendor lock-in and creating code that will be recycled and reused. And of course, that's not going to happen if you just stick code on GitHub and create a wilderness, a wasteland. It needs all of those things that Liz and Stephen were talking about, that community, plans for contribution. But we've seen friction in our community, and we've seen friction in the last few years. I think it started really in lockdown when we were all at home and had plenty of time to talk about it with Elastic. And we saw license changes away from OSD compliant, OSI approved licenses, and communities where we really think there is a social contract. Liz, I'm going to come to each of you again and ask about your thoughts on that social contract, on license changes, and where that's taking us, that internal friction that's the meat of our issue.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is about the alignment of interests. And if you have a company that's, its business is very much tied up and involved with and intertwined with the success of an open source project, then it's not a surprise that they're interested in maybe some level of control or influence over that project. And sometimes that expresses itself by having a single company that has an open source project, and sometimes it expresses itself by having a group of companies that maybe come together in a foundation and support projects through a foundation and maybe try to align their interests that way. And then the contract with the individuals contributing to the project, it may actually be an employment contract with the company, and I think that's something that we don't always talk about enough. We tend to talk about the idealistic, we're all working in our bedrooms as volunteers, but actually a lot of us are now working remotely as employees, but still having the ability to work on open source projects. But we do need to align the employees, the individuals, the foundation. We need, I actually think that foundations provide a pretty good construct for trying to align those interests in a way that can future-proof against companies who may have other agendas or changing agendas.
And we've seen that with the Cyber Resilience Act, where a lot of lobbying happened and the foundations were originally going to be treated as commercial entities and liable in the way a commercial entity is, and the European Commission. We can debate what their definition of open source is, but they've backed down on the foundation liability, which I think is an important point, and keeping those foundations sacrosanct, particularly with this internal friction. Stephen, thoughts on this internal friction?
Yeah, I think, going back to the social contract and the fact that we have it at multiple layers, very often we fail to actually define what the contract is. So at least when, my team is looking at, so we're responsible for kind of reviewing all of the open source code that may be released across the company. And, part of that initial conversation is, well, tell your users what the contribution model is actually going to be, right? Wear your agenda on your sleeve, be very upfront about what you are willing and not willing to accept in the project before it gets started, before we get down, down the line of it's got hundreds of thousands of users, it's got millions of users, and we're in a position where maybe the way we felt about how we're delivering the software, how we're attempting to monetize it eventually, changes.
Right.
I think all of the animus that we're feeling across the industry about the license changes is because effectively people feel on a deep level, you lied to me.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. So we're talking about open washing, right?
Yeah.
Faux pen licenses. We're talking about people using the term open source when it's not open source. So I guess the licensing does matter so that we can use that boundary. but it's more about how you describe it, not what you're doing, right? It goes back to Liz's point about any open collaboration being better than no collaboration, and it's how we describe it and the honesty. So I'm sort of going to take a slightly different direction with Peter. Peter and I talk a lot about this stuff. Single vendor, foundations, management of open source projects, not misleading people to where the future goes. Peter, thoughts?
Yeah, well, so the first thing I wanted to say is this, right? Then big money are involved. The ethics and morals become kind of flexible,
Yeah.
right? Now, the second thing I think we need to look in this case about very particular kind of open source, right? Which is, I think, is very much the dominating ecosystem, at least in terms of what we speak about, right? And this is a venture-funded open source, right? So what blueprint do we see those companies follow, pretty much, right? And that is open secret, right? Or I'm not even sure if it's a secret, right? In the first stage of open source growth, right, you focus about growth. You focus about adoption, right? And in this case, the open source license works well because people feel reciprocity, right? They're going to talk about your project. It's very easy to adopt. There is no friction and so on and so forth, right? Then finally, when you reach even like a saturation point, right, or at least kind of hit the stride with mainstream, you don't really need those developers to run around, right, and promote your project. You have money, so you switch the focus on monetization. You don't want those like 1% of users paying you anymore. You want 5, 10, right? And you figure out what Oracle discovered before, right, is what hostages are better than customers. You force people to pay, and the easiest way to do that, well, guess what, is to change the license so you can eliminate your competition, right, and create that lock-in, which we kind of started by helping people to avoid.
So the power of open source for me has always been the ability to fork, to lift and shift a project. So once code is shared, it can't be taken back. What we're saying is the change in license affects the future.
Yes. I think the right to fork, right, I think that is a very important and fundamental rule, right? And we can see that has been happening in Strong community, right? That happened with Elastic, that has happened with Terraform. That has not happened with MongoDB, right? And why it did not happen with MongoDB is because they didn't really have a developer community, right? We were always talking about, hey, you know what? MongoDB was built by MongoDB, and we open source that as a freemium model, right? That's exact quote from their CEO, right? In this case, of course, fork was not feasible, because you really need developer community, right? You need vendor community to make a fork, right? Just end user community is not enough in this regard.
And we actually, down in the DX room where the table holders will be after this session, we have a Terraform fork, OpenTofu, who I think are probably having their, unless they got into FOSDEM, which we didn't, they're probably having their first table downstairs. So if you want to understand the power of community and how they can lift and ship, go speak to that group of people downstairs. So I want to do the same thing and come out to you, our audience. We probably have time for 2 quick questions, if you can keep the questions quick. Otherwise, we can talk for hours on this subject. The last time we did a panel, we did an hour and a half instead of 45 minutes. And you don't want that to happen.
Yeah, honestly,
anybody
if you
in the
want
audience?
coffee today.
Or do you? Or do you?
Do we have a second question?
Thank you, panel. You touched upon the driver of the relicensing being the inflection point in competition, but do you also see the role of cloud platforms and the cloud washing effect in driving licensing?
Oh, yes. Of course, the cloud is a key competition those days.
Because before that, you didn't have this relicensing problem.
Well, that's right. But I think we not only have the cloud race over the last couple of decades, right? I think we also have the rise of open source capitalizations. I remember when MySQL was sold for $1 billion. That was huge. Now, the $1 billion exit wouldn't be considered the success, right, for the open source company. right? And in fact, that's also expectations are much higher those days.
So, Liz, do you want to jump in quickly?
Yeah, I feel like the reason to change licensing is often to do with capturing value, and we spoke a little bit about this before, but that doesn't have to be the only way that a company can capture value from an open source project. I think the important thing is for a company that wants to build a business around open source to have a very clear idea how it's going to capture value, because it isn't going to be from licensing open source code, because you can't sell something you're giving away. You have to add value in some other way. And I think that's something that a lot of particularly sort of new founders don't really internalize. It's not just we're going to build, get mass adoption, and then figure something out. That's a pretty dangerous way of thinking about how to build your business long term.
Yeah, and it's something that we talk about a lot within OpenUK. Open source is not a business model. It's a community movement. It's a way of working. It's a licensing regime. It is not a business model, and that business model is an adjunct. And I would say it's something you should be thinking about before you open source it, because once you've done it, you can't take it back.
Yes.
And what if somebody else takes it and makes a lot of money out of it? And that's what really drives this change in social contract generally, and this conversation.
So, I mean, yeah, in our morning warm-up, we were kind of like doing the coffee thing and talking about how we were going to structure this. And around the value capture, I basically said, like, be better.
Yeah.
If you're concerned with someone releasing software that has significant differentiators compared to you, you have to be better. Always, right? If you're going to build a product on top of that, you have to understand that you're going to be taking community feedback. You're going to have to deal with different feelings about how that software works, and you have to be better.
So as we wrap this panel, can I come back to you, Liz, and then Stephen, and then Peter? 60 seconds. What do you want the audience to take away? And you've got a clock there. What do you want the audience to take away from this session? We don't have all the answers, but what should they be thinking about on the internal frictions and the future of digital and open source?
Well, I guess I would start by asking for a show of hands. How many people here are either founders or working for companies that are based around open source? Okay, and how many of you think that open source is a business model? Okay, one of you does, two of you do. Right. That's the thing to think about, is what your business does that adds value around or on top of or underneath the software that you are giving away by contributing to open source.
So yeah, so I feel that as you start working in these, like if you're working in foundations, you're contributing to open source. Like I view I have a few different lenses: contributor, maintainer, sponsor. Working in a large corporation where we want to give back, we want to create community. We want to support. I feel that, one, this is a forum. You were in a room with some of the most brilliant minds in open source, honestly, and you have an opportunity to use your voice in this situation. So I think part of it is understanding who you are in the grand scheme of things, right? And understanding what your contract with other people is going to be, right? Each of us have that individual contract that builds into our team, our company, our business group level, and across the foundations that we get involved with, the open source projects that we support. So I think start with understanding who you are, and have conversations with, again, some of the most brilliant minds we've got here.
Peter, the last word.
Well, you probably all know Linus Torvalds, creator of one of the most successful open source project, Linux. And a few years ago, he wrote a book about why he created Linux, which was called Just for Fun, right? And I think that is a fantastic reason, right? I think some people would say differently. They say, well, you know what? We open source our project, or we contribute to open source out of love, right? And if that is your reasons to contribute to open source, right, then choosing their fully open source license makes sense for you, right? If it's on the other hand, like you're saying, well, I'm starting an open source project to buy island to get a yacht bigger than Larry Ellison, well, then you have to probably think twice, and maybe embracing the open source fully is not a choice for you, right? I feel what unfortunately many founders, many projects are being open sourced for wrong reasons, then they kind of have regret. And as Amanda said, then it's kind of very hard to take it back, or at least if you do, then there would be, repercussions and community blowback.
So, ladies and gentlemen, on that note, we're going to wrap this panel. Thank you.